During the years leading up to the start of the war, Hitler's policy lacked a clear direction. At certain moments, the Führer sought closer ties with Great Britain, imagining that an alliance with London would serve as a prelude to launching his ultimate offensive against the Soviet Union. Later, however, he changed perspective and preferred to eliminate any British influence on the continent, opting for a preemptive attack against France. To secure his eastern flank in case he decided to strike first in the west, he pressed his foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop to negotiate with Poland with the aim of forging a pact. Warsaw, aware of the risk of any clash with Stalin and suspecting, rightly, that Hitler merely wanted to turn Poland into a subordinate state, responded with extreme caution. Even so, the Polish leadership made a serious mistake out of sheer opportunism. In 1938, when Germany entered the Sudetenland, Polish troops took advantage of the situation to occupy the Czechoslovak region of Teschen, which they had claimed since 1920 for ethnic reasons, and extended their border to the Carpathian Mountains. This action angered Moscow and alarmed Paris and London. This excessive self-confidence in Warsaw ultimately played into Hitler's plans. Over time, it became clear that the Polish project of forming a Central European bloc capable of containing German expansion, which they called Third Europe, was nothing more than an illusion. On March 8, 1939, just days before sending his troops to occupy Prague and put an end to what remained of Czechoslovakia, Hitler informed his military leaders of his intention to destroy Poland. He claimed that this would allow Germany to seize Polish resources and expand its control into the heart of Central Europe. He was convinced that Poland had to be subdued by force, not through diplomatic agreements, before launching his offensive on the Western Front. On that occasion, he also expressed his desire to confront what he called the Jewish democracy of the United States. On March 23, German forces occupied the Lithuanian territory of Memel to incorporate it into East Prussia. Hitler decided to speed up his war plans because he feared the pace of British and French rearmament. Nevertheless, he paid little attention to Chamberlain's statement of March 31 in the House of Commons, where he guaranteed military support to Poland. On April 3, Hitler gave his generals the order to prepare Case White, that is, the invasion of Poland, which was to be ready for execution by the end of August. Chamberlain, deeply anti-communist, distrusted any rapprochement with Stalin and overestimated Poland's defensive capacity. He failed to build in time a solid alliance that could stop German expansion in Central Europe and the Balkans. In reality, the British promises to Warsaw implicitly meant leaving the Soviet Union out of that bloc. For Hitler, reaching an understanding with Stalin was the key that would allow him to launch his offensive, first against Poland, and then against France and Great Britain, even if he had no formal allies. The so-called Pact of Steel, signed with Italy on May 22, was of little significance, as Mussolini believed that his nation would not be capable of waging war until 1943. Hitler, on the other hand, trusted his intuition that London and Paris would back down and fail to honor their guarantees if Germany attacked Poland. The Third Reich's propaganda machinery intensified against the Poles, portraying them as responsible for the aggression that was actually being prepared against them. At the same time, Hitler ensured that any possibility of last-minute diplomatic negotiation was blocked, as he was unwilling to repeat the experience of being deprived of a military conflict in exchange for unexpected concessions. To convince the German public of the necessity of a war against Poland, Hitler unhesitatingly appealed to the resentment that had persisted since the First World War. He reminded his people that Warsaw had received Western Prussia and part of Silesia following the hated Treaty of Versailles. The issue of the Free City of Danzig and the Polish corridor, which separated East Prussia from the rest of the Reich, was presented as an intolerable affront. Danzig and the Polish corridor, the perfect excuse. During the first months of 1939, while Europe experienced a superficial calm, the Nazi regime focused on a narrow strip that interrupted territorial continuity between central Germany and East Prussia. This separation, imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, not only divided regions, but also fueled a narrative of grievance and dispossession that spread across all levels of the Nazi ideological apparatus. In that same area was Danzig, a city with a majority German population administered internationally since the end of the Great War, but commercially tied to Poland. Over time, it became the epicenter of the Third Reich's propaganda and strategic efforts. Berlin's tactic was to present the Danzig case as an urgent matter of national justice. Although diplomatic solutions were officially promoted, regime-aligned newspapers flooded their pages with alarmist headlines, manipulated reports, and accusations of alleged mistreatment of German citizens. The aim was not only to build a case for future aggression, but also to prepare the German population to accept as legitimate any extreme action framed as defensive. At the same time, Nazi diplomacy operated at the margins of legality. In March, while commemorating the occupation of Czechoslovakia, Hitler's government presented Warsaw with a formal proposal demanding the annexation of Danzig and the construction of a land corridor under German control. This strip, essential for Poland's access to the sea, could not be ceded without relinquishing national sovereignty. Although presented as a bilateral offer, the document was drafted so that it could not be accepted without humiliation. And so it happened. Poland refused. This refusal was the trigger for escalating confrontation. From April, increasingly direct plans were discussed in Berlin to impose its objectives without provoking an immediate reaction from France or the United Kingdom. War was no longer a distant possibility. Meetings were organized, speeches adjusted, and logistical preparations refined. Every official statement mentioned Polish provocations, every image depicted alleged abuses, and every declaration sought to position Germany as the victim. Within Danzig, the situation evolved in line with this narrative. With the Reich's backing, local authorities began acting as if the city were already part of Germany. Polish symbols were removed, non-aligned officials expelled, and public events organized with Nazi banners. Although formally still under international mandate, the city effectively functioned as an extension of the Reich. Warsaw's protests in diplomatic forums received only empty responses. During June and July, the pressure became more evident. Units were deployed near the Polish corridor, large-scale military exercises conducted, and emissaries sent to various foreign capitals to ensure any future intervention would be presented as a forced response. It was a dual-track plan to prepare the German population for a legitimate war while simultaneously deterring powers from intervening. From Warsaw, the political leadership chose to maintain a line of firmness without fully assessing its consequences. Yielding at that moment would have meant validating Berlin's demands and weakening its own regional position. Although messages were received from Western powers assuring their interest in preventing another forced annexation, the signals were ambiguous and changed depending on the channel. Polish diplomats detected contradictions between public gestures and private conversations, yet the expectation remained that any German advance would be met with a response. This incomplete reading of the external situation did not alter the government's course, which continued making decisions under the premise that an invasion could still be avoided if pressure was maintained for a few more days. The regime's propaganda apparatus stepped up its activity. From stations located in East Prussia and Danzig, daily reports were broadcast about abuses committed by Polish officials, unjustified arrests, economic restrictions, assaults. These reports were reproduced by the official press and repeated at rallies, schools, and youth organizations. In every corner of the Reich, a slogan was repeated: "Danzig must come home." By the last days of August, the atmosphere was extremely tense. Although conflict had not yet broken out, minor clashes were reported almost daily at the border: gunfire, sabotage, ambiguous military movements. Many of these incidents were deliberately staged to increase pressure and create the impression that a German reaction was inevitable. Time had become a political tool. Each day without an international response reinforced the idea that the Reich could advance without facing real consequences. It was then that one of the darkest setups of the Nazi regime was carried out, the Gleiwitz incident. On the night of August 31st, a group of SS agents disguised as insurgents stormed the radio station in that city in Upper Silesia. They had prepared a short message in Polish, partially broadcast, proclaiming, "Attention! This is Gleiwitz. The station is in Polish hands, but that was not all." To reinforce the ruse, the agents dragged a peasant named Franz Honiok, arrested the previous day for his nationalist past, to the site. He had been drugged, dressed in a Polish military uniform, and once there, was shot dead. His body was left in view to serve as photographic proof of the alleged attack. This operation, part of a larger plan called Operation Himmler, aimed to create an immediate justification for the already decided offensive. Hitler did not need a real act of aggression. A staged scene, a voice broadcast over the radio, and a uniformed body on the ground were enough to support the narrative that Germany was merely defending itself. Danzig, presented as a symbol of injustice, became the trigger. The Polish corridor ceased to be merely a territorial issue and became the dividing line between failed diplomacy and declared war. Although everyone knew what was coming, almost no one acted. While Europe hesitated, Berlin had already made its decision. The spark was lit. All that remained was to let it fall. Betrayed by the West, Poland without allies. While Polish leaders convinced themselves that German pressure could be stopped with firm gestures, in European offices the signals were different, more subtle and dangerous, where the real course was determined without shots or applause. In London and Paris, promises of support were repeated that did not always match actual movements, while in Berlin the final details were refined to prevent a war with Poland from immediately escalating into a conflict with the Western powers. It was on this ambiguous ground that the final step toward catastrophe was woven. Despite the growing tension around Danzig and the corridor, the stance of the European powers remained confined to diplomatic gestures without concrete measures. While Berlin advanced its plans with full autonomy, Polish political circles interpreted foreign signals as implicit guarantees of support, convinced that any attempt at annexation would provoke an immediate response. However, that perception relied more on repeated formal promises than on real assessments of military readiness. And in Warsaw there was reluctance to question the solidity of those commitments, even as signs of distancing began to appear. Over the summer, as Hitler accelerated his internal orders, negotiations with Moscow followed a different path. Until then, the Soviet Union had kept its distance from Berlin, but also displayed skepticism toward Paris and London. Talks attempting to bring Stalin into a joint agreement to restrain Germany were marked by mutual distrust, the slowness of British delegates, and Western refusal to accept some Soviet demands regarding spheres of influence. Moscow did not want to enter a war without concrete guarantees and also doubted the real willingness of France and the United Kingdom to immediately oppose the Nazi regime. In that context, Hitler offered what the Western powers had refused to concede: a clear division of territories in the event of conflict. The agreement was finalized quickly and without external witnesses. By the end of August, Germany and the USSR signed a pact that surprised the world but made straightforward sense to both. The non-aggression treaty sealed a truce between two opposing systems, but the most important element lay in the additional, secret document outlining the division of Eastern Europe. According to that arrangement, Poland would be split in two, the Baltic states absorbed by Moscow and Berlin given a free path westward. In Warsaw, the news came as an unexpected blow. Until then, Polish authorities had considered the USSR at most an obstacle to Hitler, not a temporary ally. Attempts to obtain direct information from Moscow yielded no clear results, and British responses were ambiguous. The sense of isolation grew, but the main decisions had already been made. Troops continued to concentrate at the border. Official speeches stressed national unity, and the possibility of withdrawing from Danzig or accepting a compromise formula was no longer on the table. The path of firmness was the only one that appeared possible, even if it relied on a network of beliefs unsupported by facts. From a military standpoint, French commanders knew they were not ready for an immediate offensive, and the United Kingdom lacked the capacity to deploy forces quickly. Nevertheless, the commitments made by both governments to Poland continued to be repeated in the press and diplomatic channels. Total support, shared honor, and serious consequences for any aggressor were spoken of, while concrete actions that might trigger a war of no return were avoided. The unspoken yet present hope was that Hitler would back down, or that a last-minute negotiation might open a way out. In Berlin, that ambiguity was interpreted as weakness. Hitler counted on France and the United Kingdom not responding immediately if he limited himself to attacking Poland, and the pact with Moscow reinforced that perception. That is why he gave the final order to prepare for the invasion, setting a concrete date and establishing that, in case of adverse reactions, diplomatic contacts would be used to buy time. Everything indicated that the direct enemy was not Paris or London, but Warsaw, and that any resistance would be brief if the attack was carried out swiftly and overwhelmingly. In the days leading up to the offensive, embassies worked to the limit. Letters were sent, urgent meetings organized, and public warnings issued aimed at slowing the attack without appearing to concede. Poland continued to wait for a strong signal that never came, while the British government discussed internal scenarios and the French cabinet evaluated its options without finding a clear way out. The situation had become so tight that every step seemed to lead to a point of no return, yet no one wanted to be the first to really move. In Moscow, the signed pact was applied with precision. While the Soviet press remained silent about the agreement with Berlin, military preparations on the western border intensified, with eyes on the map that had already been agreed upon, though citizens did not know it. The tacit cooperation with Germany did not imply sympathy, but convenience. Stalin believed he would gain time, avoid an immediate clash with the West, and expand his zone of control without having to fire first. In that cold calculation, Poland was a temporary obstacle that could disappear without direct intervention at the start. The guarantees offered to Warsaw in the preceding months, especially the British ones, were interpreted by the Poles as firm, almost automatic commitments. In reality, neither France nor the United Kingdom had defined a concrete mechanism for immediate intervention. The political message of full support did not correspond to operational capacity or the real willingness to enter a total war over Danzig. Thus, while speeches in London and Paris insisted on firmness, the generals knew that there would be no Western attack in the first weeks and that Poland would face the first onslaught alone. Even with that information available in certain circles, Warsaw did not change its central decisions. The idea persisted that resisting for a few days would be enough for the Allied powers to intervene and that the country could not cede territory without compromising its sovereignty. The idea of a tactical retreat or a temporary agreement with Berlin was discarded for political, strategic, and symbolic reasons. The result was that when tanks crossed the border, the country was alone, trapped between an open enemy and another that had not yet shown its hand. Thus ended the time of speeches and began the time of weapons. Everything that could have been said in offices, meetings, and telegrams was buried under the roar of engines and gunfire. Poland went to war without fully realizing it, believing there were still days to negotiate, unaware that the ground had already been secretly divided and that the most repeated commitments were, in reality, just words floating in a world where silence had been stronger than the warning shouts. The dawn of terror. This is how September 1st, 1939, began at 4:30 in the morning near Danzig. A German battleship opened fire without warning on a Polish garrison on the Westerplatte Peninsula, initiating the attack with artillery barrages that shook the coast. At the same time, mechanized units crossed the border in different sectors under complete darkness, executing a synchronized deployment with the priority of seizing key points before dawn. Train stations, strategic crossings, and depots were the first targets. In parallel, aircraft flew over inhabited areas, causing power outages and material damage that paralyzed essential services, contributing to an atmosphere of chaos. There was no official declaration, no ultimatum, no prior warning. The action was so fast and dispersed that during the initial moments, many Polish authorities believed they were facing limited incursions. But as reports arrived from different regions, it became clear that it was not an isolated incident, but a coordinated offensive expanding across multiple fronts simultaneously. In several towns near the western border, residents rose when they heard explosions and bursts coming from various points. Some looked out thinking it was exercises, while others fled without knowing where to go. Small groups of Polish soldiers attempted to block some access points, but the passage of enemy vehicles was swift and constant. The routes had been marked in advance, and the Germans arrived through unprotected areas. In the south, they crossed mountain passes without resistance, while the German chain of command issued reports on advances in different sectors. In Berlin, an official message was broadcast justifying the operation as a forced reaction. In reality, the deployment had been prepared in advance, following a planned sequence that left no room for error. As soon as the sun rose, several Polish cities were already under pressure, including Krakow, which felt the roar of aircraft flying straight paths overhead, as if to demonstrate they could do so without opposition, and in Warsaw, the capital, the atmosphere became thick and tense, with sirens sounding increasingly while residents tried to understand what was happening. Since official information arrived late and for a while the radios broadcast music or regular programs until shortly after 6 in the morning, the government confirmed that the country was being attacked by Germany on multiple fronts, ordering all mobilized units to take their positions, while microphones urged the population to remain calm, although many already knew that calm would not return soon because the sounds of artillery and aircraft did not stop. At the train stations, hundreds of people crowded in an attempt to travel eastward, moving away from the Western Front, where the first trains had been rerouted or cancelled for safety. In some smaller towns, there wasn't even time to flee, as tanks and armoured vehicles appeared so quickly that they took control without encountering resistance. In those places, the first civilians became collateral victims, caught in crossfire, collapses, or simply for being in the wrong place, while Polish commanders tried to reorganize in the face of an attack that did not follow a straight line but advanced along different axes, overwhelming fixed defenses and focusing on cutting communication routes between major cities where every passing minute meant the loss of another strategic point. By 8 in the morning, multiple clashes were already being reported in areas like Tuchola, Mokra or Mława, where some Polish units offered immediate resistance, inflicting some casualties on the invading forces, although the disparity of resources was evident from the first encounter. While the defenders used cavalry or outdated artillery, on the other side columns advanced with constant air support, radio coordination, and nearby reinforcements. That is why in some sectors the advance was slower, but it did not stop, and by 10 in the morning several Polish airfields had already been bombed, putting parts of the National Air Force out of action before even taking off, making it even harder to organize effective air defense. Meanwhile, official radio broadcasts reported the first military communiques in a firm tone, stating that the country would resist and not yield to aggression. In Danzig, the atmosphere before the attack had been shaped by weeks of propaganda, expulsions, and gestures of defiance against the international mandate. German control quickly consolidated with the support of local units, while the Navy secured strategic access points and Polish symbols disappeared without the need for open confrontation. The action was part of a larger operation where bombings and symbolic occupation went hand in hand. This same formula, already tested in other territories, generated a sense of inevitability among the population. In towns not yet reached by the advance, reports from displaced people, the distant sound of explosions, and partial news fueled growing anxiety that weakened any attempt at spontaneous resistance. By noon, the Polish president and top military officials were already gathered, trying to decide the next steps, while diplomatic calls multiplied from Paris and London. Although a formal declaration of war against Germany by the Western powers had not yet been made, there was already talk of serious consequences as governments tried to confirm whether the invasion was total or partial, a temporary maneuver or an extensive campaign. On the ground, there was no doubt about what was happening. Military trains continued advancing along occupied rail lines, supply trucks arrived without pause, and German army operational maps indicated that this was not a limited provocation, but the start of a full-scale operation aimed at dismantling the country's defensive structure within a week. Throughout that afternoon, clashes continued in various sectors, while communications became increasingly complicated. Messages were delayed or lost in interference. Local commands began making autonomous decisions because they could not wait for orders from the center. In this chaos, many units were isolated, trapped between two enemy columns or surrounded without knowing it, leading to premature surrenders, chaotic movements, and desperate clashes where the goal was no longer to stop the invader, but to resist as long as possible until reorganization. While the opposing divisions continued their march without pause, capturing arsenals, train stations, and observation points, always with the advantage of determining the pace, timing, and direction of the next move. Iron Storm, tanks, Stukas, and the Polish collapse. On the second day of September, the morning broke with columns of armoured vehicles advancing relentlessly along dusty roads, crossing destroyed villages and cleared fields. The German formations did not stop to consolidate positions. They merely continued their course eastward, connected by an unbroken chain of light vehicles, infantry trucks, and self-propelled artillery sections. From the sky, the roar of diving engines could be heard even before shells impacted, and tactical bomber squadrons spread panic wherever improvised resistance gathered. During that first week, the combination of speed and air precision shattered all the defenders' planned schemes, who could not maintain contact between units or reorganize containment lines. As the motorized forces pushed along the main routes, many garrisons were surrounded without firing a single shot. In German command centers, the advance was recorded as a smooth, uninterrupted sequence. Units did not follow a fixed axis, but adjusted their routes according to terrain and immediate circumstances. In several sectors, Polish lines disappeared from the map before offering resistance, leaving wide open areas. Reports indicated that many enemy formations operated in isolation, unaware of the location of their own reserves or from where the next attack might come. Air operations focused on cutting logistical access and sowing confusion at regrouping points, complicating any counter-orders. Instead of consolidating conquered areas, German forces prioritized speed. When a strong defense was detected, they did not insist it was bypassed or left behind. The important thing was not to occupy but to continue. This logic broke with traditional schemes and eliminated any possibility of tactical recovery by the Polish command. On September 3rd, while international attention focused on France's and the United Kingdom's declarations of war, German divisions continued crossing rivers without real opposition. The defensive structures Poland had built along the western border had become useless, having failed to stop the initial advance. At that moment, the Stukas operated almost without restriction, repeatedly attacking retreating troops and sowing chaos in military traffic. In several sectors, Polish cavalry battalions were caught in the open with no chance to seek cover. Some attempted to regroup in forests, but the Air Force already knew the key assembly points and acted preemptively. There was no respite or pause. Planes returned repeatedly to the same targets until silence fell. German mechanized columns, often without direct cover, penetrated the interior of the country at a steady speed, encountering empty villages and clear roads. There was no need to clear conquered areas because the objective was not to occupy but to keep advancing. Coordination between units was maintained through a network of messengers on motorcycles and light vehicles traveling tirelessly back and forth. From the German High Command, the directive was not to stop for any reason. This implied leaving pockets of resistance along the route untouched, something unthinkable in previous campaigns, yet in those days this tactic proved effective. By leaving stragglers behind, the front became more confusing for the enemy, who no longer knew where the critical points were. The Polish command could no longer control what was happening on the ground. Logistic connections were broken in several sections, orders were delayed or failed to arrive, and some divisions moved without central coordination. Defensive positions intended to stop armored vehicles followed no strategic pattern, and the few well-positioned troops were isolated after the first impact. In several regions, German units struck without warning, collected supplies, and continued their advance without pause. They did not follow a predictable direction, making it impossible to respond before everything was overrun. Chaos spread in the rear areas of the combat zones. Caravans of displaced civilians, wounded soldiers, and scattered patrols arrived in villages where no one knew what was happening. Attempts to re-establish territorial control were futile because the front no longer existed as such. Enemy columns did not advance in blocks but along independent paths that disrupted any attempt at planning. While some detachments reached key points in advance, others took unexpected detours. This fragmentation maintained the pace of the advance and nullified any organized defensive strategy. When it seemed that an area was holding, the attack came from an unprotected flank or from the air. By September 5th, several central cities were already within the enemy's reach, without a frontal confrontation occurring. Civil officials fled without reporting, and railway hubs were blocked by abandoned or bombed trains. Some units still on the move were stopped before completing their routes. In certain areas, German artillery acted with a precision that could only be explained by prior reconnaissance of the terrain. On the outskirts of Łódź, a Polish group attempted a holding operation but was hit by crossfire before advancing. Enemy tanks, knowing the region well, chose less traveled routes to strike from unguarded areas. On the 6th and 7th days, Polish commands were already talking about a general retreat eastward, but many sectors could not move because they were isolated. In some cases, unit leaders received contradictory or nonsensical orders, while reports spoke of complete loss of contact with entire divisions. In the south, resistance in mountainous areas tried to stop light vehicles with natural obstacles but was overcome by units that diverted and attacked from the rear. The idea of forming a second defensive front was discarded because there was neither time nor resources. Meanwhile, the Germans occupied key points such as depots, river crossings, and radio antennas without having to engage in prolonged fighting. By September 8th, Warsaw was almost surrounded. Forces sent to reinforce its defense barely managed to arrive, while others were trapped on already taken or impassable routes. Inside, authorities tried to organize urban resistance without clear information on enemy movements. The German advance had been too fast, and what remained of the defensive system began to dissolve with no possibility of coordinated response. The week had begun with surprise attacks and ended with half the country out of control. In just 7 days, the combination of fast tanks, tactical aviation, and flexible command had overwhelmed any planning. The German army did not need to occupy everything it crossed, it only needed to advance. At that point, what came next no longer depended on defensive lines but on an irreversible reality. The enemy had no time to reorganize, and every new attempt was crushed before it began. Unable to stop them, a Polish army overwhelmed in every way. The Polish formations deployed in the southern and northern areas failed to connect with each other. In the central part of the country, the divisions were poorly positioned and lacked clear instructions. Some units, such as those of the Prusy Army Group, were not yet fully mobilized when they were directly hit by enemy attacks. This grouping, intended as a reserve force, never operated as a unified entity, and its regiments were pushed to different points without coordination or air support. Throughout that week, the plans on paper lost their meaning in the face of an offensive that showed no respite and did not follow expected patterns. In the northern zone, Polish units failed to stop the enemy's advance. There were attempts at resistance at various points, but the initial bombardments disorganized all responses. Some formations lost their maneuvering capability before even opening fire. Officers sought to regroup troops, but many routes were blocked, and others were already occupied. The retreat became confusing, with roads filled with isolated soldiers, non-combat personnel, and disabled transport. The lack of coordination spread as meeting points fell out of reach. Meanwhile, in the south of the country, the forces assigned to defend the mountainous regions faced similar difficulties. Units in Krakow and around Katowice were scattered, poorly supplied, and lacked regular contact with high command. Some regiments waited for reinforcements that never arrived, while others moved into areas already traversed by enemy units. The Polish command tried to react, but the lack of real-time visibility over the overall situation made coherent decision-making impossible. Without modern transport, it was impossible to keep pace with the rapid movements of the German columns. Many units moved by trains that were stranded after bombardments or advanced along dirt roads where vehicles frequently broke down. In this scenario, commanders made decisions on the fly, guided by what little they could observe. The situation worsened because the communication routes were fragmented and messages took time to circulate, forcing regional leaders to act autonomously in an increasingly chaotic environment. On the political front, messages of support from abroad were not accompanied by any real action. Although France and Great Britain had declared war, no effective offensive was launched in the west. The Polish command continued to hope for the opening of a second front, but as days passed without change, morale began to fade. Nevertheless, orders were given to resist at all possible points, even though the chances of success diminished with each passing hour. High command decisions were made without a clear picture of the situation, and many orders were outdated by the time they reached their recipients. The Polish Air Force, severely reduced and with few operational aircraft, could not cover all fronts. Most planes were being used for reconnaissance or occasional missions with little effect. Pilots did not have safe runways, and enemy attacks on bases forced them to move from one location to another without rest. On the ground, anti-aircraft defenses were scarce and concentrated in a few cities, unable to protect moving columns. Enemy air superiority made any transfer a risky task. Units attempting to establish a new defensive line were interrupted before completing their deployment. On some occasions, when they managed to temporarily halt an advance, they were flanked by other formations appearing from unforeseen directions. In rural areas, roads were not built to withstand the constant passage of troops, and many positions were isolated without supply routes. In several towns, officers chose to stay in place without waiting for orders, while other groups simply disbanded amid the constant movement. Across the country, the lack of organized reserves prevented sending reinforcements to critical points. New recruits did not reach the fronts and were reassigned before entering combat. Newly mobilized men gathered in recruitment depots that lacked sufficient equipment and in some cases were assigned missions without prior training. The speed of the enemy advance made it impossible to complete the full mobilization planned months earlier. Many divisions remained incomplete, and local commanders had to reorganize their forces without manuals or clear procedures. The Polish High Command tried to establish a line of resistance along the Vistula River, but the disordered arrival of troops hampered this effort. In some stretches of the river, bridges had already been destroyed or were under constant surveillance. Nevertheless, an attempt was made to create a new front using mixed units and what remained of the hardest-hit corps. At the same time, contacts with the Allies yielded no useful responses. Messages of encouragement came from Paris and London, but without concrete details on immediate actions. Expectations of external support began to weaken in internal reports, although officially it was still counted on. The collapse of communication lines, the fragmentation of units, slow transfers, and the absence of Allied reaction created a scenario in which maintaining a centralized strategy was no longer possible. Each group operated with the information available to them, and only fragmentary data was collected at headquarters. In this environment, reaction capacity was reduced to local attempts with no overall impact. Meanwhile, the major cities began preparing to receive thousands of soldiers withdrawn from the fronts. But trains were full, roads congested, and uncertainty dominated every decision. From east and west, the double invasion and the end. While fighting still raged on the Western Front, another unexpected advance overwhelmed the Polish defenses from the rear. On September 17th, Soviet Union troops crossed the eastern border without a formal declaration of war. They moved in organized columns, advancing rapidly through barely defended territories. From the very beginning, the Kremlin forces avoided clashes with the Germans, moving through sectors not yet occupied by the Wehrmacht, thus fulfilling terms secretly agreed upon weeks earlier. The Warsaw government, already overwhelmed by attacks from the west, found itself surrounded. The escape plan to Romania was immediately activated. That same day, the highest civilian and military authorities left the country through Kuti, leaving the remnants of the army without a unified chain of command. The Soviet forces encountered no organized resistance. In many villages, the local population, especially Ukrainians and Belarusians, either watched silently or collaborated with the new troops raising red flags. Polish units still operating in the eastern region were cut off, some disarmed without fighting, while others were surrounded and captured. Meanwhile, German pressure from the west continued unabated. Armored forces kept cutting railway lines and capturing strategic points, while the Air Force bombed escape routes used by soldiers and civilians. Warsaw, besieged for days, resisted attacks with heavy artillery and daily bombings. The densely populated city, without basic services, suffered the effects of the siege every hour. At the same time, in Brest-Litovsk, representatives of the two victorious armies held a joint ceremony. German and Soviet commanders paraded in the main square, exchanging greetings and coordinating the handover of predefined sectors. On the ground, adjustments were applied to the dividing line between the two powers. The agreement, initially drawn on maps during the summer, was redrawn to allow more efficient control. Some villages captured by the Wehrmacht were handed over to Kremlin forces, while other points were retained by the Germans to secure logistical routes. In this context, cooperation between the two forces became visible in other cities such as Lviv and Grodno, where coordinated operations ensured full occupation without interference. In the southern regions, the last Polish formations were trapped between two simultaneous offensives. From the east, Red Army columns advanced from Volhynia and eastern Galicia, occupying key areas without encountering organized opposition. Escape routes were blocked one by one. Without contact with command or access to basic resources, detachments quickly lost cohesion. Some attempted to leave the country through forests and rivers toward Lithuania or Hungary, discarding what they could not carry. Meanwhile, Soviet patrols intercepted those moving off the main roads, and thousands of soldiers and civilians were taken to Kremlin-controlled areas with no possibility of return. On September 28th, after more than 2 weeks of siege, Warsaw surrendered. The city, overwhelmed by urban collapse and with no hope of external support, could not resist any longer. The decision to cease fighting was made by local commanders upon realizing that prolonging the struggle would only worsen civilian suffering without altering the outcome. The resistance, though exhausted, held on until the last moment as a gesture of dignity before an enemy that already controlled everything surrounding the capital. With the advance completed and without significant pockets of resistance, the occupation of the territory was already an irreversible fact. Central structures had collapsed and effective power was in the hands of the new foreign controllers. In many towns near the old internal borders, residents observed the first changes without fully understanding which authority now governed their lives. While troops established checkpoints, depots, and administrative commands, everyday life froze, waiting for orders that arrived in another language under different rules. There was no clear transition, only a silence of power where the old had disappeared and the new had not yet fully revealed its shape. Cooperation between the two powers was not limited to the military sphere. Lists of common enemies were exchanged, arrests coordinated, and information on residual movements shared. Polish officers captured by the Germans were handed over to the Soviets if they resided in areas now under Soviet control. The same occurred in the opposite direction. This silent collaboration, though temporary, had direct consequences for thousands of people who were sent to camps or executed without trial. At the same time, both powers launched internal propaganda campaigns presenting their intervention as necessary and legitimate. In Berlin, they spoke of restoring order amid chaos. In Moscow, of protecting minorities and ensuring regional security. With the surrender of the last pockets of resistance in early October, the military campaign was declared over. In just 5 weeks, a country of over 30 million inhabitants had vanished from the European political map. The double invasion, executed with precision and without official coordination between the invading powers, had achieved its purpose without direct intervention from the Western powers. France and the United Kingdom, though formally at war with Germany, carried out no offensive on the Western Front during that period. Poland was left abandoned, fragmented, and fully occupied. From that moment, a new phase began under opposing regimes, but with similar methods of control and repression. In the occupied territories, everyday life changed immediately, and for millions of people the future was sealed under a foreign occupation with no end in sight. Thus closed the September campaign, with a country dismembered by two powers that had signed a secret pact weeks earlier. German and Soviet troops, entering from opposite sides, met in the center and there sealed the temporary disappearance of a nation that had resisted as far as it could. The war had only just begun, but for Poland, the initial stage had already left deep scars and open wounds that would not heal soon. Slavery, genocide, and Western silence. The future. They allowed, after the German occupation, Nazi Party officials implemented a system of mass selection of Poles to be transferred to the Reich as forced labor, in addition to choosing young women to be employed as servants. Hitler made it clear to the army chief, General Walter von Brauchitsch, that the goal was to have cheap labor and to rid Germany of what he called undesirables. Blonde children who fit the Aryan ideal were separated from their families and sent to German territory to be adopted. At the same time, Albert Förster, Gauleiter of West Prussia Danzig, sparked harsh criticism from the more radical sectors of the regime by authorizing a large number of Poles to be reclassified as Germans. Although this process was humiliating, for many it represented the only alternative to avoid expulsion and retain their property. Even so, the men could not escape for long. They would soon be forcibly recruited into the Wehrmacht. On October 4th, Hitler proclaimed a general amnesty that absolved soldiers involved in the murder of prisoners and civilians. Officially, these actions were justified as a reaction to the accumulated hatred over the alleged Polish atrocities. However, not everyone in the army shared this view. numerous officers expressed discomfort at what they interpreted as a weakening of discipline. One of the clearest testimonies appeared in a letter from an artillery commander who described Dantean scenes. "We have witnessed horrors in which German soldiers loot and burn homes, kill and steal without measuring the consequences." His words reflected the indignation of those who saw adult men acting without awareness of their actions, violating basic rules and tarnishing what was, in theory, the honor of the German soldier. Lieutenant General Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding the Eighth Army, strongly protested the massacres of civilians carried out by the SS, along with their auxiliaries from the Sicherheitspolizei and the Volksdeutscher Selbstschutz. When Hitler heard his report, he reacted furiously and told him that "you cannot wage a war according to the rules of the Salvation Army." Any other complaints from military commanders were met with sarcasm and contempt. Nevertheless, many German officers shared the idea that Poland had no right to exist. None of them opposed the invasion for ethical reasons, and several veterans, former members of the Freikorps after World War I, recalled their violent border clashes with Poles in Silesia. The campaign in Poland, and what followed, served as a rehearsal for the future Rassenkrieg, racial war, that Hitler was preparing against the Soviet Union. Approximately 45,000 people, including Poles and Jews, died at the hands of regular German troops. The SS Einsatzgruppen shot psychiatric hospital patients with machine guns. Under the secret name Operation Tannenberg, a detachment of these special groups was deployed in the rear of each army, tasked with eliminating or capturing aristocrats, judges, journalists, professors, and any figure who could become a leader of Polish resistance. On September 19th, Reinhard Heydrich unambiguously informed General Franz Halder that a cleansing Jews, intellectuals, priests, and aristocrats would be undertaken. Initially, these acts of terror were disorderly, especially those committed by local German minority militias, but by the end of 1939 they began to take on a more systematic and organized character. Although Hitler never hid his visceral hatred of Jews, the systematic and industrial extermination that began in 1942 was not part of a clearly designed plan from the outset. His pathological anti-Semitism led him to repeatedly express the idea that Europe should be purified of all Jewish presence. But before the outbreak of the war, his projects were more aimed at applying unbearable pressure to force emigration rather than physical annihilation. The so-called Nazi policy regarding the Jewish question was never uniform. In fact, speaking of policy can be misleading considering the institutional chaos of the Third Reich. Hitler's disdain for administrative matters allowed a tangle of agencies and ministries to emerge, competing with each other. Tensions between Gauleiters, the SS, party officials, and the army itself resulted in a bewildering lack of coordination in open contradiction to the image of discipline and efficiency the regime sought to project. A single offhand comment by the Führer, or the desire to anticipate what he was believed to want, was enough for various officials and authorities to implement measures and projects on their own, without consulting other bodies or worrying about overall consistency. On September 21, 1939, Reinhard Heydrich issued a directive setting out the preliminary measures regarding the Jewish population of Poland, which before the invasion numbered about 3.5 million people, nearly 10% of the total population, the highest proportion in Europe. In the Soviet-controlled zone, there were about 1.5 million, to which another 350,000 who fled eastward before the Wehrmacht's advance were added. According to the order, Jews remaining under German occupation were to be concentrated in large cities with good railway connections, thus preparing for mass transfers. On October 30th, Himmler ordered that the Jews of the Warthegau be transferred without delay to the territory administered by the general government. The vacated homes were to be handed over to Volksdeutsche settlers, many of whom had never lived in the Reich and whose language was barely intelligible to Germans. Hans Frank, who ruled authoritatively and corruptly from the Krakow castle, reacted angrily upon learning he would have to receive hundreds of thousands of displaced Jews and Poles. There was no plan to house or feed these human masses, nor had it been planned what to do with them. In theory, Jews capable of working were to be exploited as slave labor, while the rest were to be temporarily confined in urban ghettos until they could be resettled. In practice, confinement in ghettos without sufficient resources or food led many to die of hunger or disease. Although it was not yet a systematic extermination program, these decisions represented a crucial step in that direction. The difficulties involved in moving millions of people to a supposed colony that was never properly defined increasingly led to the consideration that eliminating them might be easier than relocating them. Among Hans Frank's first decisions upon assuming the role of Governor-General of Poland was to personally remove the silver eagle that crowned the royal castle in Warsaw, which he associated with the alleged oppression of the German people by the Poles. He also showed no interest in rebuilding the ruins of the city centre, devastated by Luftwaffe bombings, and moved the administrative headquarters to Krakow, taking residence in Wawel Castle. Frank's main role as head of the general government was to dismantle Polish cultural identity, while promoting German culture through the opening of theatres, cinemas, bookstores and museums dedicated to German art. He worked to marginalize the Polish language and confiscate radio sets, prohibiting their possession to prevent the population from hearing their own language, except via street loudspeakers broadcasting German victories in Polish. Soon, he ordered the closure of all stages, banning theatrical performances, folk songs, café concerts, and any expression of traditional music, including Chopin. Additionally, he imposed restrictions intended to humiliate and subjugate. Poles were forbidden to practice sports, travel by train, use restaurants, or sit on park benches, which were reserved exclusively for Germans. His declared goal was to weaken the intellectual and moral capacity of the population, promoting instead alcoholism, abortion, and theatrical shows based solely on sex and eroticism. Another crime in which Hans Frank was directly involved was the implementation of the Holocaust. He was the one who promoted the idea of concentrating tens of thousands of Jews in an isolated territory located in the so-called Lublin Reservation in southeastern Poland. He was also responsible for creating the Warsaw Ghetto, where from 1940 approximately 400,000 Jews were crowded together, later deported to the extermination camps of Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor. Official documents bear Frank's signature authorizing measures that led to the deaths of nearly 1 million Jews during the Shoah, as well as ordering the transfer of around 2 million Poles as forced laborers to the Reich, where they were exploited almost like slaves in factories supplying the German war machine. Although he actively participated in the subjugation of the Polish population and the repression of its culture, banning traditions, displacing entire communities, and contributing to genocide, Frank experienced a contradictory internal conflict. Personally, he did not feel deep hatred toward the Poles, but he was unable to disobey orders coming from Berlin. The most revealing example of this tension occurred in 1942, when Heinrich Himmler proposed a plan to deport the entire Polish population to a territory that would be created in a defeated Russia. Frank opposed the idea, which led to his being subjected to an SS disciplinary tribunal on March 5th. Nevertheless, he managed to emerge practically unscathed, as the only sanction was to accept the supervision of an NSDAP inspector within the administration of the general government. The growing power of the SS within the general government eventually led to clashes with Hans Frank, who publicly expressed his opposition to Himmler in several speeches delivered in Berlin, Vienna, Munich, and Heidelberg. When Hitler learned of these events, on August 16th, he prohibited Frank from participating in public events, and on the 24th of the same month he punished him severely, stripping him of all NSDAP positions. The decision enraged Frank, who submitted his resignation as head of the general government of Poland, but the Führer rejected his resignation and forced him to remain in office as Gauleiter. From 1943 onward, the general government under Frank's leadership obtained some flexibility from Hitler to implement a slightly more conciliatory policy toward the Poles. In the province of Galicia, recently incorporated and located in western Ukraine, he occasionally did not hesitate to provide weapons and supplies to sectors of the Polish resistance to counter the nationalist insurgents of the Ukrainian insurgent army. However, this shift proved useless. On October 15, 1944, Red Army troops entered Poland, and shortly before the German withdrawal, the general government was officially dissolved. Although looting, executions, killings, and disorder made life unbearable in the Nazi-controlled areas of Poland on the other side of the new border, in the Soviet-controlled part, the Poles also found no better conditions. Stalin's resentment toward Poland dated back to the Polish-Soviet War and the defeat suffered by the Red Army in the Battle of Warsaw in 1920, known to the Poles as the Miracle on the Vistula. On that occasion, Stalin was harshly criticized for failing to secure the support of the 1st Cavalry Army for Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky's forces, a mistake with severe consequences. Years later, in 1937, he took advantage of the purges to order Tukhachevsky's execution on fabricated charges, thereby initiating the bloody purge of the Red Army. During the 1930s, the NKVD, in its campaign of espionage accusations, found an easy target in the large Polish community residing in the Soviet Union, largely composed of communist activists who were persecuted and used as scapegoats in repressive trials. Nikolai Yezhov, head of the NKVD during the Great Terror, developed an actual obsession with alleged Polish conspiracies. Under Order 00485, issued on August 11, 1937, the Poles were implicitly defined as enemies of the state. After just 20 days of arrests, torture, and executions, Yezhov submitted a report to Stalin, who approved it. Excellent. Continue tracking and cleansing this Polish trash. Eliminate it for the good of the Soviet Union. The campaign specifically targeting Poles during the Great Terror led to the arrest of 143,810 people accused of espionage, of whom 111,091 were executed. The probability that a Polish citizen would be shot during this period was 40 times higher than that of any other Soviet resident. According to the Treaty of Riga of 1921, which ended the Polish-Soviet War, Poland had retained territories in western Belarus and Ukraine, colonizing them with veterans of Marshal Józef Piłsudski's legions. However, after the Red Army entered in the fall of 1939, more than 5 million Poles came under Soviet rule. For Moscow, any expression of Polish patriotism was, by definition, counter-revolutionary. The NKVD then arrested 109,400 people, most of whom ended up in the Gulag, and 8,513 were executed. Soviet repression targeted all those capable of embodying or preserving the Polish national spirit: landowners, lawyers, teachers, priests, journalists, officers, and officials. It was a deliberate strategy of class struggle and the elimination of the national elite. Soviet-occupied eastern Poland was divided, the northern zone annexed to Belarus, and the southern zone incorporated into Ukraine. Mass deportations to Siberia and Central Asia began on February 10, 1940. At temperatures falling below -30 degrees Celsius, NKVD rifle regiments escorted 139,794 Poles, who comprised the first wave. Families were informed of their new destination with shouts and rifle butts at the doors. Red Army soldiers, accompanied by Ukrainian militiamen and led by an NKVD officer, stormed homes with weapons raised, issuing threats. They searched closets, overturned mattresses, and looked for supposedly hidden weapons. To the Adamczyk family, an officer said, "You are part of the Polish elite, the masters and lords. You are enemies of the people," among the phrases most frequently repeated by the agents. One summed up the logic of Soviet repression: who has been Polish will always be a kulak. Families were given only a few minutes to prepare for the painful transfer, forcing them to leave homes and farms with no chance of resistance. Most were paralyzed by the prospect. Men, whether adults or children, were forced to kneel against the wall, while women hurriedly gathered what little they could carry: a sewing machine that might allow them to earn a living in exile, kitchen utensils, bedding, family portraits, a rag doll, or schoolbooks. Some Soviet soldiers openly showed discomfort and, in low voices, even apologized. In isolated cases, families were allowed to milk a cow or slaughter a chicken or small pig to have some food for the journey ahead. 3 weeks confined in cattle wagons. Everything else had to be abandoned. Thus began a new Polish diaspora marked by forced uprooting and suffering,